Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Human Libraries of Procurement podcast. We call it Human Libraries of Procurement because of three basic elements: the human connect, the libraries part, which shows knowledge and wisdom, and procurement because we talk about procurement. One such Human Libraries of Procurement is Steve Davison. Stephen, thank you so much for doing this. How are you doing today?
You're welcome. Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you very much for asking. You?
Yes, all good, all good. We just, the city I'm from, Bangalore, just won the IPL. It's a big thing. So we were celebrating a lot yesterday.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Cricket is the sport in India, isn't it?
Yes, it is quite. So Stephen, I think we'll start with your career journey and how you landed in procurement and what you do. And from there we take it.
I'm going to have to be careful not to talk about 25 years of resume or CV, otherwise everyone will literally fall asleep, right? There's only so much you can do to make software asset management and procurement interesting. So I'll kind of fly through the top bits, and then if you want to jump into anything that you can do. So I started in a space, software compliance, in 1997 or 98, I think. And the term software asset management wasn't really about then. And actually, I had very little to do with procurement teams back then. My only real engagement with procurement teams was I worked for an organization called the Federation Against Software Theft. Now, these guys had been created to protect the intellectual property of software publishers. If you think back to maybe 10, 15 years ago, before DVDs, if you put a video on, or actually a CD, at the beginning of the movie, you would see FACT, FAC, right. Federation Against Copyright Theft. Well, right. Federation Against Software Theft was just the alternative, or the different division. So I spent a few years doing that, working with end users and the likes of Microsoft and Oracle and IBM, all the big publishers. And the thing that really struck me during that time was procurement were the ones that had to mop up a lot of the mess of the companies that once the deals had been negotiated, put in place, how the software was then consumed by IT and end users was totally out of procurement's hands. And then you come around on this 3-year cycle and the software publishers say, hey, we don't think you're licensed properly, so we're going to audit you, and procurement will be left holding this kind of relationship. So that was that was my first experience of working with procurement teams. And then as the years went by, there were international standards such as ISO and then ITIL, which I was lucky enough to be involved in from an authoring perspective. And that's when the whole movement towards moving away from compliance from an end user perspective moved on to more around how can we efficiently manage our software properly. So how can IT and procurement work together to kind of not keep the costs low, but manage the cost of software, because within IT it's probably top 2, top 3 expenses within IT. So yeah, I did that for a number of years. I contracted and consulted, and then eventually I ended up setting up my own business called Infraware, where we basically worked as an independent. So we worked with procurement teams, and we would just literally sit down with them, look at their top spend, maybe look at their tail end spend, and then look at where they could maybe make savings within the first 6 to 12 months that were real savings, tangible savings on current contracts, and then more importantly, how we could help them create target operating models to manage software in a sustainable fashion. So I said a few moments ago, very often procurement are left with the relationship of Oracle, IBM, and some of the other big publishers, but they don't get to see how the software is consumed. So we would try and build that gap by creating processes and policies and technologies to enable procurement to have a little bit more visibility into the software estates and how organizations were using their software. Eventually sold one of my companies and a piece of software to a large reseller, Software One. And it was basically a process management tool based on ISO and ITIL, and it helped organizations benchmark their maturity, but then also digitize their processes. So I talked about that target operating model for sustainable management. That's kind of what I, if you like, digitize. So we sold that Software One, worked in Software One and had a real big eye-opener working in the reseller space globally. So this was just before COVID. And although Infraware was fairly global, we weren't in every corner. And I think my first job within Software One was to go to Sao Paulo and train the guys there on how to use this platform that had over 800 questions in it, which was difficult at the best of times. So did that during COVID, and then I ended up working in KPMG for a very short spell, just under a year. I had some friends there that they wanted to set up a managed service and push that through. So I did some initial work there, but that came to an end. And I had the itch to then start another business, which was Abstrato, which is what we're doing now, which is a similar field, but just, again, digitizing some of the processes and looking at how you can create a space where procurement, ITAM teams and vendors can collaborate and talk to proactively manage costs and intellectual property. So hopefully that's 25 years done in 5 minutes. It wasn't too boring.
It's always difficult to concise that all there, right? And
it is
a lot of
I think the British can be a little bit, we don't want to talk about ourselves, about everything that we've done. But hopefully that gives you a fairly broad, view of my background over the last 25 years.
No, a lot of good experience. Well done there. So I picked up the part that you worked with IT Procurement Team a lot. My first question was that how do you engage IT procurement team?
There are many different angles with how we would engage procurement teams. I guess that when a software publisher midterm is asking an organization for usage results, so, how you license, we've negotiated this term with you on these basic agreements. We'd like to understand how you're using it. All software publishers have that term in their contracts. Some of the large organizations can take it out if they're mature, but that would be one of the places how we would engage initially with the procurement team. The second one, and I mentioned this earlier on very briefly though, is around the whole cost takeout space. So if you think of software procurement people now compared to 10, 15 years ago, the number of commercial applications I think is 4- or 5-fold. And right. That kind of top 80%, where the top 80% spend is growing considerably. But then also, if you look at the Tailend spend, that's growing as well. But the visibility from a procurement perspective isn't necessarily there, because SaaS software tends to just go through the back door, if you like, and users can use it. So those are the two areas: the compliance angle, and then a software procurement team wanting to reduce their cost of software. The difficulty for procurement teams, as I mentioned this earlier on, is they don't get the usage information from IT. And that's normally because IT SAM team don't have the relevant information or experience, or aren't using the right tools to come back to procurement and say, you want to reduce your costs, or you're trying to manage compliance with a vendor. This is exactly what's installed. This is exactly how it's used. And this is how it correlates back to the terms and conditions. So there's this gap in the middle where IT don't quite understand the terms and conditions, which is understandable because it's not their job. And procurement don't quite understand how the consumption is taking place within the IT estate. So those are the two areas that we would typically get involved in.
Right. A lot of times, especially for software, it becomes more of demand management stuff, but we'll discuss this in details. Before we get there, I just have a disclaimer that because there is so much of experience, so much of working with other companies and all, just a disclaimer that we are not representing any company here. Even if some names come out, it's just because, we're there. And the second point, the second point that I wanted to put off is we have a chat window here. If anyone from the audience has any questions, please put them in the chat. I would be very, very happy to read it out to Steven and Steven would answer them accordingly. So I think we are done with the intro part. I'm done with the disclaimer part. That's a heavy 2 minutes that I need to do. Moving on, what do you say in terms of current situation? You touched on it, that IT has increased like 4 and all. In current situation, what are the issues that we are facing?
Software procurement teams is probably multifaceted. I guess the first one is the complexity of licensing. It's always been complex. I mentioned a short while ago, the sheer number of commercial applications that are coming through and how they come through a business. It used to be you cannot buy this unless it comes through procurement, it gets authorized, sign off, etc., etc. Now with SaaS software, it's a little bit easier because it's a monthly subscription rather than a big CapEx number. So that's probably the first one. I guess if you look at how, and this is me putting my cynical hat on, okay, but if you look at how much money software publishers put towards both the contract placements and the selling of their intellectual property, it's high. Their intellectual property is their sale, their good. So it stands to reason that they put high amounts of money into that. And I think sometimes what can happen is IT procurement teams aren't quite given the resources that they need to negotiate with confidence with software publishers. And, we can go into more detail later on around audit defense and such like, but there've been a few scenarios where the publishers will tee up scenarios. And I think sometimes procurement, and I don't want to make too many assumptions, but very often I feel in many organizations, IT procurement are constantly trying to prove themselves, and they're also trying to make sure that IT teams use them right from the concept of buying a piece of software. So if there's a software publisher that's making a challenge on a contract, it's very often IT that will kind of want to step in place. But sometimes if they're not given all of the right information from IT in terms of the usage and how the software is being consumed, it can be a real problem. And I think that's where we need to try and address that and bring IT and procurement to talk a lot more. And I know that a lot of the viewers or listeners today on this podcast will be kind of nodding and smiling, going, "That's so old, Steve. We've been telling people that this needs to take place like from day dot." So I know I'm not saying anything new there. I think more of a cultural thing. There needs to be more awareness that if an end user doesn't do what they should be doing around how they consume software, that will affect IT, let's say IT service management, and then that will affect procurement. But the issue when it gets to procurement is the numbers that we're dealing with, they're like telephone numbers. So if someone isn't doing properly at a user level, it's maybe affecting change management, incident management. It's costing millions of pounds. And I'll give you an example. Oracle a few years ago changed their terms just overnight and said, okay, well, look, anyone using Java, we're going to change our terms and conditions. And it doesn't matter if you've got just 3 people using Java in your enterprise. We're just going to go on employee count. So let's say you've got 3 people using it, but there's actually 20,000 people in your organization. We're going to take the price of the installation and times it by 20,000. That's your new figure.
Right.
Now,
that's crazy.
The usage, that is crazy, but it's happening all over the place.
Right.
And Oracle's just probably the best example because everyone knows Oracle. But the implications of IT procurement not being forewarned by IT on how Java is being used in the business is a really big issue. But yet IT procurement are left to deal and negotiate with Oracle. And that's just one example.
Right.
Yeah, those are the big ones for me, I think.
Yeah. I have a question here from Alex. He says, is software license renewal negotiation a really tough place to be seen to make a difference? Constant increase when install difficult to exit. Of course, you said the
Yeah.
overnight terms and condition change is another problematic area.
Yeah. Well, and again, if I take a step back and we think of most IT procurement teams, you can't manage every single renewal. You have to look at where, let's say, maybe 70 or 80% of your spend is, and then apply your resource to those renewals. So even then, you're missing a whole load of tail end spend that's coming through the door, which I think is a big problem. So you've got two sides of that renewal coin. So if we just focus on the top vendors, if you look at what's delivered for most procurement teams, the renewal dates are missed because the reminder doesn't sit in Ariba or SAP or wherever it might be, and it comes with 3 months. Then if you go to IT and say, we need this information in terms of installation and usage, it takes probably 6 months to do that work. So it needs to be kind of almost being programmed in from like 10 to 9 months beforehand, so you can get the installation, you can look at the usage. So actually, who's really using the software? Well, there's only maybe 60, 70% of the end users that are using this pro version of whatever piece of software. So actually, we can reduce that down. What about other areas? Do they need to sit in a SQL server? Do they need to sit in cloud? Well, actually, maybe not. So let's turn those off or throttle them back. And I think my biggest issue when I'm working with IT procurement teams is they desperately want this information, but the software asset management teams are snowed under and don't always have that information. If at all, for many organizations, there isn't a software asset management team, so there will be no usage data. And I think if you are working on a Microsoft or Oracle or IBM deal and you don't have the usage information, it's kind of almost, it's not pointless going into the contract negotiation, but you really do need all of that information. And I think this is where a lot of IT and software procurement teams get frustrated, I think, because there's just too much data and too much work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just a point on that, that's where, if you look at, so 10 years ago, the notion, maybe 15, the notion of software asset management services came about. So a lot of the resellers and one or two of the smaller independent organizations created managed services. So they would say to a procurement team, leave it to us, we will manage that, we will take all of your data, we will give it back to you, and we will do 2 Microsoft, they call them ELPs, effective license position. I think it's a real reseller term. I don't know where it came from. And that was the start of a very big relationship between SAM organizations, SAM teams, and IT procurement teams. So much so that Gartner now have a magic quadrant for it. It's a little bit contentious, because if you're going to do a renewal and you're going to use a reseller, the reseller has to work off their bottom line. Their bottom line is from selling more software. So you're kind of like, there's a conflict of interest in some cases with SAM managed services. But no, Alex is right. It's a very difficult place. And I'm sure for most of the listeners today, you would like to look at all renewals and challenge to understand if the software is really relevant anymore in the business, or if there's maybe a space to rationalize 2 applications, or if indeed, Sally or John in accounts really need the pro version of whatever software, has been deployed in the business.
Right. And just to add to this, we've established the fact that it is a problem area. And you touched on the solution mode a little bit, that, you engage the procurement team at the right time, or, the data is the key to a lot of things. But what other things can we leverage? What can be the solution to this problem?
I'm a big believer in cultural changes. So I mentioned it right at the beginning of this podcast. If you can change the behaviors of end users and teams on how they buy and consume software, then that's the root cause. The second is really around the process and collaboration between IT procurement and whoever's going to manage the, let's say, audit data of software hardware and licensing. Because
Right.
I think we talked about managed service providers earlier on, where they kind of take over and do that work. But invariably, unless they have access to all servers, all areas within the business, and can work very closely with the internal teams, then they're kind of outside the perimeter and they can't get all of that information. So for any large organizations, I'm kind of talking about, 1,000 employees upwards, the best scenario is to look at your processes of how software comes into the business. From a procurement perspective, that is, okay, well, once we buy this, is there someone that's not just putting it into the procurement system? So we're talking about, we just purchased one copy of software, or let's say 1,000. This is the name, this is the publisher of the software, this is the name of the software, this is the version of the software, this is where it can be deployed, and this is a high-level view of the licensing terms. And I mean high-level view, just like 4, 5, 10 bullet points. So that information is captured at the procurement stage. Now, I appreciate it's not just procurement information in there. We're taking summary information of the terms of that piece of software. So that's the first phase. The second phase is, and this wouldn't be software procurement's responsibility, but it would be a software or IT asset management, or maybe a FinOps if they were involved around cloud consumption and purchase. It would be their responsibility. But straight out of the purchase, okay, we're now going to look at the installation of this software. How is the installation going to take place? Is it group or is it for a specific number? When does that take place? Let's audit those numbers. Then let's put them back into a system that can marry up to the procurement information so that we've got some numbers, whether we're plus or minus. And then over a period of time, that's managed every quarter, depending on the software, the cost of the software, the publisher and how aggressive they might be in different regions, would depend on how frequently and how much resource you actually put into that piece of software. But it's not a blanket, as we know, for every piece of software.
Right. And during your career, in the course of doing things, are there any success stories that you would like to share?
I've definitely got a few success stories, also got lots of failures as well. And it's like anything, right? The success stories are really good and they make you feel nice for a while, but it's normally the projects that don't go so well that teach you the best.
Learning projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to share a few. I think some of the best work we did was after a short period. So if I take a step back, when I first set up Infraware, I bootstrapped it, had no funding, and I had this very purist idea of Infraware would be an independent software asset management practice. We would work with IT managers and heads of procurement to help defend against aggressive software publishers. And I think the issue for us was we were always trying to bite off more than we could chew. We would go to big organizations like Jaguar Land Rover and go for contracts that were worth millions, and they'd like us, but they would always say, you're just too small and we will break you, and you're not turning over more than £5 million, so our procurement process won't let you work with us. So we ended up doing a lot of work with Microsoft. So Microsoft came to us and said, hey, we hear you've got Infraware, you're doing a really good job, lots of good noises coming out of the industry. We'd like you to work on our global SAM program. And that was working with heads of procurement and heads of IT, where Microsoft felt that organization was under licensed. So they would go in using PwC, KPMG, the official auditors. And we were the ones that would go in behind, and because we were independent and not a compliance body, we would have to do the process work, or we would look to tidy up and make sure everything, the client was left happy, if you like, because invariably there would be big compliance bills. But the work that we picked up from that and what we learned, I think we must have done close to 1,000 projects globally around the world between 2013 and 2017 or 18. It taught us so much. But the best the best projects from those were when organizations would say, okay, well, obviously we did have a problem with Microsoft. Now come in and help us work in other areas, help us with our processes. What other publishers can you look at? Because we don't want to be going through that compliance process. I think more recently, our biggest approach when I set up Abstrato was to work with large organizations, and we would, I'm going to use this term loosely, but we would jokingly say to heads of procurement, £500 says that you're overspending probably by about 20%, maybe 25% on your software budget. Now,
Right.
that's not, before everyone jumps on me in the chat, that's not termed as an offensive statement to procurement. It's just more of a tongue-in-cheek challenge,
Right.
simply based on our background. I mentioned the process and the maturity work that we did for like 10 years. We would probably ask about 4, 5, 6 questions and very quickly understand what sort of maturity that organization had. And then depending on that maturity, we'd be able to put like okay, well, chances are you're probably 5% wasting budget, or maybe there's 10% wastage that we can look at, or 15%. And when I use the term wastage, it's where I talked earlier on about that gap where procurement don't have the visibility on how stuff is being consumed, software, and IT don't necessarily have an understanding or visibility of the original contract that was signed. So we would work as this conduit in the middle, where we would then go and it's a little bit like looking through trash cans and looking for the areas where there is waste or optimization that can take place. And because we're not selling software, there's no gain from ourselves apart from just a day rate. So I think in the last few years, getting Abstrato up and running, we did some really good work with a number of financial organizations and a few energy companies, where literally within the first 12 weeks, we'd spotted 12 to 18% in, what term do we use? Cost optimization. So within 12 months, we knew that we'd identified a bunch of things that software procurement manager could then take out of those renewal contracts that Alex was talking about earlier on. Those are probably our best, and that's very rewarding. That's, as an individual and a company, okay, I did the tongue-in-cheek, £500 bets that we can find, but when you can do that work, it's incredibly rewarding. And I think it's helpful to procurement teams as well, because so often they're expected to get 0.2% off a contract, or they're expected to go back to their software reseller and say, look, we can give you a one supply, but we want another 3% off of all of the software we're buying. And that can get really hard for a lot of IT procurement teams. But actually using this kind of work, where you're being really creative and you're using an independent agency, not just Abstrato, there are plenty of others out there, to go and look at really exactly how the software is being used, that's it's all benefit. It's all benefit to the organizations.
What is very interesting in that these learnings of procurement is also learnings of entrepreneur, right? So a lot of procurement is business acumen, and those two are something that go hand in hand. Do you think the same, you being an entrepreneur as well?
I think it's very kind of you to call me an entrepreneur. I guess I am. I think from our perspective, our challenge when we're working with internal teams, and this is a serious point now. I know I was joking earlier on about the making bets around wastage. Challenge is to not be too positive in this space. So for us, it's about, when we're growing business, about risk and reward. How much risk do you put in, and how much reward do you get back? And you have to, obviously you have to temper that to make sure. And sometimes you'll fall over. And I know for sure that, I've fallen over a few times. In fact, literally over the past few weeks and months, we've had to pivot some of the things that we're doing. As an independent working in this space, it's quite difficult when you're working with the resellers. But I think our biggest challenge is maybe being too confident and too positive when we're looking at the cost saving numbers, I think. Because for some IT procurement people, you've got to be careful what you're saying internally to the board and the executive. And if there's 15 to 20% wastage, actually, you could flip that and say that's a really negative thing. You know, on whose watch? You can imagine the board looking at this going, on whose watch have we been wasting 15%? But the real truth, the absolute reality of this situation is, for too long, the software publishers have made it incredibly hard for procurement teams and IT teams to manage and understand how software is consumed. I don't want to go into the whole technicalities of how you audit software, but it doesn't matter whether it's in the cloud or if it's on premise. It's incredibly hard. You know, it's not a tangible asset. It moves around like crazy, can be installed. The terms and conditions get changed left, right, and center. So it's one of our biggest challenges when we're working with large organizations and there is an opportunity to save money. It's also the socialization and education to the board to make sure that they understand that unless they fund IT procurement and software asset management or IT teams effectively in their own organization, they will always have this wastage. And if they do have this wastage, it's not down to the people that are in play right now, it's just that they're under-resourced. And that's such an important thing for any IT procurement specialist that's working in this area. You know, there will be waste, but it's absolutely not your issue. Well, it is your issue, but it's not your fault because it's kind of fallen down the back of the settee. It's probably a bad analogy, but I think you know what I mean, right?
Right. I think SaaS softwares have made it a point, what you said, right? That they want procurement to be out of this loop. And I mean, it has worked for some years for them, but it is not good for the company. You know, it is not good for the overall system that is there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. The best way to describe SaaS for me is it's almost like ungoverned digital transformation. So you hear of big digital transformation programs where everyone is aware that Workday is being implemented or SAP, and we know about Microsoft 365. We all know about those digital transformation projects, but they're normally in a handful, you know, the top 20 applications or vendors. There's then a myriad of software that's being produced because it's much cheaper and easier to create SaaS software. Prior to 2021 or 2022, there was a lot more funding for SaaS applications. But it's ungoverned because you have an end user that it's not going through CapEx, it's probably going through OpEx. The number is so low that procurement aren't involved. But then, and this is the real issue and kicker for any organization, it's not just the cost of that software. If the renewal sits on automatic, it just gets renewed, that person leaves, IT don't know about it, procurement don't know about it, and there's this silent whirlpool of SaaS applications going around on auto-renew that no one really knows if they're being used or not. So that's one impact of cost for a SaaS application, but it's multi-layered. So for example, what about the IP that sits in that SaaS application? Do we really know about it? What about data sovereignty? Where does the data sit? And of course, you've then got the security issues to go with it. So SaaS for me is a really big, right now, everyone's talking about cloud cost optimization with the big hyperscalers, right? So GCP, AWS, Azure, super important to manage those because if you don't, you can spin up a number of servers and you can lose control very quickly. But there's a handful of hyperscalers, and as long as you apply good process, you can manage them. But in terms of SaaS applications, there's more than a handful of SaaS applications. There's thousands. And this is where it's a lot more. If you look at the cloud space and break it down to SaaS, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, SaaS is by far the biggest and the most frenetic in space within cloud. SaaS is 3 times bigger than the other two, and also you've then got more vendors. So from an IT procurement perspective, it's a problem on on a number of levels, not least because of the sheer number, I think. So I'm quite passionate about it.
I have a comment here from Alex. Alex says, when you work for a global company that sells businesses and buy businesses, can the journey to a single ERP ever really pay for itself? Will it ever end?
Yeah,
Coming
it's a
together.
tough one.
Yeah.
From a licensing perspective, it's incredibly messy when large
Right.
organizations are merging together. It's not impossible, but I think so often little resource is put into that, or should I say, organizations underestimate how much time and money it's going to take to bring those data sets together. I think definitely.
Right. And Alex also adds that he had over 100 ERPs in one such instance.
Is he still smiling? I bet he's not.
Right. Now, one thing that came up was the MSP. Now, I know there are good points. There might be bad points as well. But tell me as to how you see as to MSP solving this problem.
Well, it's a fairly mature market. There's a magic quadrant for it where different standards are recorded. But I think over the coming years we're going to see some issues with the MSPs, in as much as procurement, for example, want much more than just license positions on the top 5 or top 10 big ticket items like Oracle or IBM. They're good, they're needed, but I think where the MSPs need to start looking is how they can be much more flexible in their approach to reporting, and it's quite tricky, because they have to try and price out exactly what they're going to do over 12, 24, 36 months. But traditionally, MSPs have really just provided a number of reports around big publishers. I think what needs to happen is there needs to be more flexibility around all publishers. So IT procurement and IT need to be able to say to MSPs, okay, so maybe there's a drawdown of mandates, and we need to look at, for example, X amount of applications that might do X, Y, and Z, that might sit in the same field, because can we rationalize, is there a similar product to Workday that we could swap over to? Or actually, there's a migration happening, and we really need to know exactly what applications are sitting over here before we can migrate them, because we don't want to do lift and shift, because if we do a lift and shift and we move it all to the cloud, there's just going to be lots of technical debt that sits in the cloud, and we're going to be paying for stuff that we really don't need or aren't using. So procurement, IT procurement and IT, I think, need much more flexibility from MSPs. How that will come about, I don't know. I think it will have to start, we'll have to have some sort of modular type set of services whereby organizations can just draw down on a certain number of mandates to experience a certain output, whatever that might be. But I think we definitely need change, especially as, and without getting too geeky, within the software management space, you've got ITIL as a framework that's been around since 2000, I think, years. You've got the ISO standard that's been around for 20 odd years. You've got FinOps, which is now really, taking hold. And the convergence of IT asset management, software asset management, and FinOps is coming together. How they come together, I think, will be a good thing for IT procurement. Because if you look at FinOps, it's very much about we're understanding OPEX, and we're understanding on a monthly basis what our waste is. And we know that if we don't manage that waste, it's waste every month. Whereas traditional on-premise software that was maybe more CapEx, it can kind of get hidden out under the covers or amortized over a few years. So what FinOps is doing is really highlighting the fact that this can't be ignored, and the management and measurement of consumption is super important, and someone needs to do it. And FinOps people have been on this really big kind of journey of culturally bringing awareness to the boards and IT that, it's not good enough if someone just spins something up, because it affects the whole business.
Right.
It also affects IT procurement. So I think what will need to happen over the coming years is the MSPs will need to look at how they bring ITAM and FinOps together, and then how it can support the various components of a client. And IT procurement needs to sit right at the front of the table with their wish list of stuff that they need. And it will be around installation, usage, cost of service. And then they can get involved properly with finance and IT teams when it comes to working with publishers and providers.
Right. Yeah, I think very good point there, that it ultimately affects the entire thing rather than only the IT team. Again, question that you touched upon, but I wanted to do it a little more detail. What is your view on the cost takeout projects and procurement?
So I think traditionally, and I touched on this earlier on, when you're talking about cost takeout with IT procurement teams, understandably from their side, it's looking at the big ticket items, so Oracle, IBM, etc. It's also about working with the reseller to see where they can maybe take some notional points off of the margin that the reseller might be taking, especially if it's on one supply. But there's probably a few areas that could be addition to that. The first one is, and I've mentioned it all the way through this podcast, is usage. So it's all very well that we know what's installed, but how is it really being used in the business? And does it need to sit in a bunch of different places? Are all the versions that we have really applicable, or could we switch to standard? What about the kit that it's sitting on? It's sitting on really expensive, fast kit. Well, it doesn't need to. Okay, let's adjust all of that. And there's no way that procurement would know where to look for that or even ask the questions. And then on the IT side, IT are kind of providing some basic numbers, or maybe there is a product manager that's been given the responsibility of provisioning data back. Now, a product manager is really good. They have a set role. It's to manage your product, if you like, or be responsible for it. Managing the terms and conditions and how it's consumed in the business and the strategy for optimizing it is a difficult one, because it's not necessarily within their skill set or their terms or their roles and responsibilities. So very often procurement teams can be slightly let down in that space, so they don't get the real usage information they need on those big items. And the second space, I touched on this earlier on, is if you look at the tail end spend of perceived versus reality, very different now in all organizations. That tail end is huge, and it has a big cost associated with it, and it's growing because of SaaS we talked about earlier on. Now, invariably, there are a number of organizations that will work on a no savings, no fee model. It's something that we've done before on a few occasions. We don't always do it. You need to have very flexible procurement processes and accounting processes, but it is possible. You also need some basic terms in there. But if you look at that tail end spend, that's where you could have an independent SAM practice come and work with you, and they can use the savings from that tail end spend to do two things: identify more cost than the cost of their services. That's the first one, and that's a bonus. The second one, which is probably more important, is if they know what they're talking about, they can help you build out a target operating model. So what should good management look like between IT procurement and IT on an ongoing basis with all of the different applications that you've got? What audit methodology should we use for the big vendors? Where are we going to put our resources? How are we going to automate some of this? Because we do want to automate some of it. How do we record information right at the beginning? And by creating that operating or that target operating model, you can have this consensus between the various teams in terms of how they work, the data outputs that they have, and the key vendors they're going to manage, and then the ones that they're going to leave. If you can have that, then you have a sustainable software asset management system that totally supports IT procurement. If you don't have that on an ongoing basis, then it just becomes like every year everyone's scratching their head and just getting very grey and bags under their eyes because they've just got too much data coming at them and too many big renewals they've got to try and negotiate without the information. So I think cost takeout is a really important part of an IT procurement team's armory, if you like, but it needs the right resourcing, or you need the right people that have kind of just been auditing software for most of their career.
Right. A lot of time, the tail spend actually becomes a lot interesting because it gives you a lot of information, and at times Tails combined with Maverick spend, which is hidden, gives you a lot insights that you don't know in the starting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's
totally.
very interesting at that time.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you.
Right. I have a question from Alex about AI. You see as to the near future, how IT procurement or software procurement would look like?
Okay, that's such a big one. We could probably do a whole podcast on that, couldn't we? Maybe we should. So I think for me,
second round.
Yeah. No, let's not do that to the viewers. But very, very quickly to answer your question, I think there's a few components to the answer to this. The first one is, and I wouldn't purport to know all of them, but procurement teams are now starting to use AI to create some efficiencies. But that's something I wouldn't go into straight away now. For me personally, because I don't have the experience of it. I think procurement have and will have some really good leverage coming up over the next few years. So without going into too much technical detail, Microsoft's CEO at the beginning of the back end of last year said, hey, SaaS, he didn't quite say SaaS is dead, but he nearly did, right? And the idea behind this is you can have a front end, a really simple front end, you can have a back end, and you can put an AI agent in the middle. And that will kill a lot of SaaS applications that have been trying to build up automation and intellectual property over the last 5-10 years, spending millions of pounds. I'm not saying the SaaS world is going to die, but where this will end up is there will be a lot more organizations that would traditionally have veered away from building their own software to building their own software, whether it's using Lovable, whether it's using a low-code platform, or just having developers building their own applications. And this is where I think is quite interesting for procurement, because the leverage or the opportunity to sit down with a large publisher and say, we do like your software. So let's use Workday as Alex's example earlier on, or Concur. We do like Workday. We want to stay with you. Your prices have increased by X percentages, and that's not something that our business can soak up. We can't work to that model. We are now going to look at building up our own platform that does this. Now, it won't be as shiny as yours, and it might not have all of the functionality, but it'll have the functionality that we need. So right now, Mr. Workday, this is what we're thinking of. We want to leave the negotiations open, but we'll come back to you in a few months when we've made some decisions. Now, we all know those software publishers will be looking at that situation and thinking, right, okay, so the whole lock-in issues, the whole lock-in process that we tried before is not quite there, because these people now can go and get their own software built. Now, I'm not saying you can go and get your software built in half a day and it will be really fantastic, and the cost of management won't be expensive, but it's a real option now that AI is driving a lot of organizations, large and small, to looking at building their own software applications, especially when you've got the introduction of AI agents coming about and being so effective now. So I think that's a really good thing for IT procurement. The other space, very quickly, is there are some plays in AI. I don't want to talk about what we're doing, but we have a collaboration tool that enables procurement and IT and SAM teams to work together. The next phase of what we're doing will be searching the internet for the terms and conditions that are changing mid-year by Oracle, IBM, or Workday, and bringing it into one central place, so that IT procurement and SAM teams or ITAM teams can see this in a reduced format for them, rather than having to hire 10, 15 people to go and keep abreast of this, which they can never do, and that has never happened. That information will be at their fingertips. So I think, for me, those are the 2 or 3 things that I see as...
I'll just add one more point here. I think the AI part would do a lot of demand management in that space as well. So I think those internal problems that are there, those can be AI's first step, and then maybe they'll go on to develop something further.
Yeah, I think one thing's really important to say here, from a software asset management and IT procurement perspective, obviously, and understandably so, I think there's a lot of concern from all of us about, where AI is going, from an ethical
Mhm.
perspective, where it's going for all of us with jobs. It's going to take all of our jobs away. But I think one of the fundamental points in IT procurement, and I'm talking about software procurement specifically, I can't talk about the whole industry procurement, but it's heavily under-resourced. It's just so heavily under-resourced. So having AI tools to come in and help software procurement people or vendor managers or contract managers will be immensely powerful for those teams that are just so under-resourced. And that's the same for software asset management as well. So I'm quite buoyant and I'm quite accepting of AI, because for our sector, I know that it will do only good things for those teams that are under-resourced.
I know you have a app now. You are building it and all. Would you like to talk about your company and your app?
Yeah. Well, it's like I said at the beginning of this, we've got to be careful not to talk too long about the things that we love, right? Otherwise, we could send people to sleep. And I'm mindful that we've been talking to close to an hour now. So, okay. So we've had to pivot a little bit because we were kind of looking at the wrong place. And it's the same, when you're starting a company, you can think this is a good idea, but then slowly but surely there's something else that drops out, and you can find the value. And essentially for us, that's what we've been doing over the past year. We built a platform, and what's come out of it is software asset management teams want a specific place where they can collaborate with IT procurement and the rest of IT. So it could be change, it could be incident, it could be IT security, it could be the vendors, software publishers, where they can manage those renewals almost like their own cyclical projects. So we talked about having renewals and managing renewals. Our platform creates almost like a project management place and space with different roles and settings for SAM, ITAM, FinOps, IT procurement people, and some vendors to work together on those renewals or audit pieces, if you like. The second part of the application is really what we're building now, and that's the bit that I'm excited about, which is how can we then take all of that data globally that our clients are using, summarizing it and present it back, so we can then say, hey, okay, so in NORAM or APAC or EMEA, these are the top 3 vendors that are aggressive on software audits. These are the top 10 gotchas from a terms and conditions perspective. So watch out, IT procurement people. And these are the notional cost numbers for different modules that people are buying. So to an IT procurement person, you're getting a bird's eye lens of what's going on around the world. And also, are the publishers changing their terms and conditions mid-year? So I mentioned Java at the beginning of this. So all of that information in one place for software asset management teams, FinOps teams, and IT procurement should, I think, hopefully help towards that, those teams working together, collaborating, and being much tighter, if you like, in terms of understanding and respecting each other's requirements for data and their responsibilities. So that's the end game. That's what we're aiming for, but time will tell, right? Yeah. Outside of that, we're always open to doing cost takeout for any of the viewers. That's where we started the business, and that's kind of central. I don't think we'd been able to create the applications if we didn't have the understanding or the background of what we've done for Microsoft or the cost takeout programs.
Right. Good luck with those projects.
Thank you.
Now, if anyone has any question, we are almost going to end. So if anyone has any question, please put them in chat. I know we touched upon the intellectual property and data. Where does it sit in the contracts and all? Anything you would like to mention about IP, intellectual property and data, to focus as a procurement buyer?
A huge subject in the context of software asset management and software procurement, but I think for a lot of your viewers or listeners on this podcast today, they might have seen audit defense services, or they may have been in a audit where a publisher has invoked the audit clause for whatever reason. Invariably, and without being too much of a cynic, it can just be because you haven't renewed on time, or you haven't purchased any software, and so the publishers will act accordingly. Again, dependent on the region that you're in and the cycle of your contract and their financial year. But a lot of organizations don't realize that if you document an audit methodology, so this is your software, Mr. Publisher, there's 4 modules in it. This is how we've audited it, and it could be however you want to audit that software. You document it. These are the terms and conditions or the licensing. We've merged these 2 together. This is how we did it. These are the results that we got to. If you wrap that up, put it in a blockchain, it doesn't need to be our blockchain. It can be anyone's blockchain. So the numbers are irreversible and can't be tampered with. Send the key to the software publisher. Say, this is what I've done. I know that we have an audit clause, but I'd like to share this information and the methodology with you. I'd like you to review it. Tell me where you think I've gone right, where I've gone wrong, and what you think about my numbers. Now, if you do that, and a software publisher comes to you and says, we'd like to do a compliance audit, or we'd like you to run an audit, you can pause there, revert back to the previous activity in the communications with blockchain, and they won't be able to come in for a few reasons. But if you put that all to one side, if you are proactive with your publishers and you do something like that, they will know 9 times out of 10 that there's no low-hanging fruit and it's pointless going in. Now, we've been talking about this for about 5, maybe 7 or 8 years. How do we know this? Well, we used to work with Microsoft globally, so we picked up a few tips, and of course I worked at the Federation in Software Theft. It's 99 point, I'm not a lawyer and you shouldn't take this as legal advice, but it's the 15 years that we've been doing it, when we were providing managed services, and any of our clients that have done this, they've not received the compliance audit request. And if they have, they've referred back to this process and it completely kills it. Now, why am I bringing this up? Why is it so important? Well, for most organizations, the threat of being audited when it goes up to the board and the mess that it causes in terms of resource applied is huge. And it's hard to quantify as well, because you're putting people's time into it, where they've got daytime jobs. As much as we are under-resourced in this space from an IT procurement perspective and software asset management, this is one corporate hack that we can all apply that completely kills this problem 99.9% of the time. So talking about IP and how best to help organizations, that's probably my number one hack.
Thank you, Steven. Thank you for all the time. Is there anything that you would like to add before we end?
No. Really enjoyed the process. Was a little bit nervous at the beginning. I've done a few of these the other way around. Being on the receiving end of the questions is obviously a little bit different, but thank you for being a great host and some of the questions that have come out from yourself and Alex.
Right. Thank you, Steven, again. It was a very knowledgeable session. I learned a lot. I hope the audience, and when I put it on YouTube, they learn a lot from here. Not many people know software procurement, and not many people know it as good as you. So a lot of learning process. Thank you so much for it.
That's really kind. Thank you.
Right. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Steven, again. Have a nice day, everyone, then. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
If you like this video, please like and subscribe to the channel.